I'm David Wilcock, and I welcome you to Disclosure. This is our opportunity to have a fireside chat about some of the most fascinating information ever put forward by anyone who has been writing books and doing research. What we have here is a 14-episode miniseries on ancient history. If you think that you know all there is to know about ancient history, you may be very surprised. Never before have we had such an array of incredible talent put together in a synergistic sequence where one concept builds upon the next, and we have all these guys talking to you and talking to me, because I'm interviewing them, about some of the most fascinating mysteries in Earth's primordial past. Now, skeptics oftentimes believe that we have nailed down the truth. There's nothing more that really needs to be discovered, and that orthodox mainstream thought is infallible. This is much like a religion, the belief that what we know now is all we need to know. Skeptics also can be very aggressive and very sarcastic and shaming and demeaning in the way that they try to convey their opinions. We are not looking at anything here that requires us to suspend disbelief. We're not looking at fantasy. We're not looking at fiction. And we're not looking at something that was channeled by angelic beings from higher realms. We're looking at straight-ahead, hardcore empirical data that can be researched. Anybody has the opportunity. It's democratic. You can go out there, you can verify this stuff for yourself. The guy we're starting with today is Graham Hancock, and Hancock is specifically one of the most brilliant pioneers in the entire field of ancient civilizations. In 1995, he released Fingerprints of the Gods. I had it as soon as it came out. I'd already read 300 books by that point on this topic. I was blown away by what Graham Hancock had to say. In the traditional view, civilization begins with the so-called Fertile Crescent and Sumeria, and then it progresses forward to ancient Greece, and this is the first time that we have any really significant architecture and roads and systems of law. Some of that does occur in Sumer, but then it kind of grows into its fruition in ancient Greece. The new knowledge is the idea that there was a highly advanced ancient civilization before Sumer, before all of this stuff took place, and that what we think of as recorded history is in fact not the only history that's been recorded. It's only the approved version of history. And the deeper truth may involve the concept that there was a civilization that had greater technology than we have now, and that was wiped away in a gigantic catastrophe that started roughly 12,980 years ago, and then put the Earth into a profound period of cold for 1,600 years, after which time there was yet another catastrophe, and both of these catastrophes involved massive flooding and literally wiped the surface clean of the Earth, taking away whatever remnant of this foreign civilization had once existed. So we're going to explore this as we get into this first episode of Disclosure with Graham Hancock. Check it out. All right, Graham Hancock. I am obviously a friend of yours, a huge fan. What you did with Fingerprints in the Gods for me was a phenomenal thing. I had been reading 300 books on ancient civilizations up until I found yours. Mm-hmm. And I started to get really tired of it because everybody's trumpeting the same data. Everybody's got the Rhodes calculator. Everybody talks about Stonehenge. Mm-hmm. The antediluvian flood maps. And then along comes this book. I think it was 1995. I just graduated from college. Yeah. And bam, this guy has got all of the best stuff that I had seen in all these 300 books I've been reading, mm-hmm. and other stuff that I'd never found before. Yeah. So a lot of people know you for that.
Definitely. It's definitely my best known book, no doubt about it. Yeah.
And that was a major seller, right? Like you sold a lot of copies at the time.
About 5 million copies of that,
5
of
million?
That book, of which 2.5 million in hardback in Japan.
Wow, really?
And the other 2.5 million around the world. It became a bit of a sensation.
That's incredible.
In Japan.
That's an incredible number.
It was.
You
it
can't
was
do that now.
You can't do that now. It was a phenomenon.
Yeah.
It was one of those things. It caught a wave. There was a lot of new stuff in the air. There was a suggestion that maybe we've got the story of civilization wrong, and I think I was fortunate to write Fingerprints when I did. I think it caught that moment. If I had published it some years earlier or some years later, I don't think it would have had that impact.
And it is true that actually the people that wrote the movie 2012 optioned the rights to...
They did indeed. They optioned the rights, and if you can bear to sit through the 20 minutes of credits at the end of that movie, you will see that it does say at the very last line, inspired in part by the book Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock. Yes.
Well, and 2012 is allegedly a disaster movie in modern times.
Yes.
Why would they use your book for that?
Well, actually, I would have liked to have... Were I a producer, which I'm not, I would have liked to have seen that movie delve a little more into archaeology.
Yeah.
But what they took from that book, I would say, was just one thing, which was, as far as I know, Fingerprints is the first book that has connected the Mayan calendar with Charles Hapgood's notion of Earth crust displacement, and those two issues were actually key to the scenario in the movie 2012.
And let me
they didn't take anything else from.
Let me just briefly toss in for people who don't know that Hapgood's theory is that the external crust could slide over the mantle.
That's right.
And therefore the whole Earth has a shift in its crust, even though the inner part is still in the same place.
Indeed, and rather like the skin of an orange moving around the fruit, to give an analogy. And this was the mechanism envisaged in the movie 2012 for the cataclysm that they portrayed there, because Roland Emmerich does do big cataclysm movies, and this was at the heart of that idea. I think that I definitely would have liked to have seen more archaeology in the story, but they focused on the big effects, and
it seems strange that they would want to option Fingerprints of the Gods for a movie that only barely touches on two little data points.
Well,
in the book.
As the project developed, their ideas of what they were going to do with the project changed, and they became more focused on the cataclysm and less perhaps on the backstory to the cataclysm. That's what they became focused on.
So there may have been some Mayan calendar stuff in the earlier drafts of the script and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and indeed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we go into your story, because I want to do the whole arc, if you were going to try to briefly summarize what we learn from Fingerprints of the Gods, what would you say is the hypothesis or the goal of Fingerprints of the Gods?
At the heart of it, that we are a species with amnesia, that there has been a major forgotten episode in human history, and we are not taking that forgotten episode into account in our understanding of who we are and why we're here. That has been buried, partly as a result of global cataclysmic events, 12,980 years ago or thereabouts, and partly because there are forces at work in our society that don't want that information known, that want the idea of a simple linear development from primitive Stone Age hunter-gatherers through settled civilization to us, the apex and pinnacle of the human story. And if you're committed to that timeline, then it's very annoying to discover that there was an earlier episode of civilization when humanity did achieve a very high level, which was brought cataclysmically to an end, so massively and so severely, as Plato put it, that mankind had to begin again like children with no memory of what went before. I think there are people who do have that memory, but I don't think they want it. They want it shared. So that's the message at the heart of Fingerprints of the Gods, I would say.
The people who don't want this to be shared, it appears that there has been a narrative constructed in the average person's mind in which they might listen to what you just said, but then they'll say, well, there's no evidence.
Yeah, because the whole institution of archaeology and mainstream history has set before the public, through the media, through the education system, a timeline for the story of human civilization. And that timeline has become embedded in the way that we think about ourselves. Right. And that timeline is this linear story from primitive cavemen to smart, super sophisticated, modern human beings, and that we're supposed to have gone through certain episodes of development. You know, we started to make agriculture. That agriculture provided the possibility for a leisure class who could become the priests and kings in the cities that were formed. And we went on from there. Yes, there were some ups and downs, but by and large, it's been a straight, clean story. And what disturbs that is the possibility that we've forgotten a whole episode of earlier civilization and new bits of archaeology that are coming out, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which cannot be denied by the mainstream, because mainstream archaeologists have actually found that archaeology, themselves create ripples in this timeline and make it difficult to explain. You see, if you're telling people that hunter-gatherers were this very simple kind of society who were not capable of large-scale feats of engineering and construction, and then suddenly in the hunter-gatherer epoch, before anything like a city or a civilization is supposed to have existed, you have a very large-scale project with enormous stone circles and multi-ton megaliths being put up and requiring intense organizational skills, management of a workforce, a plan, all of that in place. It doesn't fit with the picture we've been given of what our ancestors are supposed to have been like at that time. And when I first went to Göbekli Tepe and talked to Klaus Schmidt, the excavator, who unfortunately has recently passed away, but I had an opportunity to spend 3 days walking around that site with Klaus Schmidt in 2013. And I said to him, what does it feel like to be the man who's discovered the site that's rewriting history? And he was very careful. He said, no, I prefer not to say it's rewriting history. I prefer to say it's adding a new chapter to history. That seems to me how mainstream archaeology is trying to finesse this. Right. That they still don't want their basic timeline, their basic story of human progress to be disturbed by this. They just want to fit it in to the existing model. I believe it won't fit into the existing model. It's going to overthrow everything.
The conventional archaeologists will attack guys like you. I've seen this online a bunch of times. They say, if guys like Graham Hancock say that this civilization was here on Earth and it was very advanced, show me the pottery shards, show me the linear curve of how they built up to the point to be able to manipulate these large blocks of stone.
That's what they say, and that's why Göbekli Tepe is becoming a serious problem for them, because that, for example, that particular point was made in relation to the Great Sphinx of Giza, and the notion that the Great Sphinx might be vastly older than 2500 BC. Well, the argument of archaeology was, how could that be so? There is no other large-scale monument, which is 12,000 plus years old anywhere in the world. If there was a culture that could make the Sphinx 12,500 years ago, then surely it must have made other monuments as well. Well, suddenly we have that other monument. We have Göbekli Tepe, and it's not even very far from the Sphinx.
That's true.
So, it becomes, the whole notion that the Sphinx may be much older suddenly becomes much more credible than it was before. I think the second point, which archaeologists are not taking into account, archaeologists tend to be uniformitarians. They don't really like cataclysms very much, and they don't, in my view, take enough account of the role of cataclysmic events in the story of human civilization. And again, there's new information and new evidence here. We now know it's really no longer in dispute that the Earth was hit by a fragmenting comet round about 12,980 years ago, give or take 5 years. You can bring the resolution down that tight to a very exact date from the Greenland ice cores, because when comets hit the Earth, they leave a signature in the chemistry of the Earth all over the planet. Nanodiamonds and iridium and platinum. There are remnants, and these have been preserved in the Greenland ice cores, and we can say for sure this event happened 12,980 years ago, give or take 5 years. And it initiated an episode that geologists have been aware of for a very long time, which they call the Younger Dryas. You see, 12,980 years ago, the Earth was coming out of the Ice Age. The Ice Age reached its maximum extent 21,300 years ago, approximately. And there began a gradual meltdown. Not always gradual, there were some episodes of rapid flooding during that story, but it was a process of warming. And then suddenly, 12,980 years ago, for reasons that until recently it's not been possible to explain, the Earth was plunged back into a dramatic refreeze. Went back to colder than it had been at the coldest point of the Ice Age. And that's the episode that they call the Younger Dryas. And it lasts from 12,980 years ago, give or take 5 years, down to 11,600 years ago, when suddenly the cold lifts and the Earth resumes its warming process. You have roughly 1,600, 1,700 years of radical, unexplained deep freeze. We now know why that happened. It happened because of that comet, which fragmented. Its fragments hit many different parts of the Earth, but the greatest impact of all was in North America, and it was on the North American ice cap. That's why there isn't a crater, because the ice cap was best part of 1.5 miles to 2 miles deep. Okay, and that fragmenting comet smacked into the ice cap. The crater was made in ice, not in the body of the Earth, and that's why we don't see the crater today. But what we do see are the chemical signatures of that impact all over the world. So the comet hits. The initial effect is dramatic large-scale flooding because the ice cap is suddenly liquidized. There's a huge flooding event results from that, which leaves scars all over the North American landscape. And then enormous quantities of dust are thrown up into the upper atmosphere. These enshroud the Earth completely in a mantle of dust, which stops the sun's rays reaching the Earth. Then we go into the deep freeze, called the Younger Dryas, because the sun's warming effect on the Earth is no longer happening. And it takes 1,600 or so years for that dust mantle to disperse. It's possible that the Earth interacted again with fragments of that comet, and that may be part of why it ends rather suddenly about 11,600 years ago.
What's the data on sea level? What did it do to sea level?
Well, then you have a very rapid episode of sea level rise, exactly following 11,600 years ago. So you have your instant flooding, 12,980, sea level goes up, then it goes down again because you go into a freeze. Then 11,600 years ago, the Earth is suddenly warming up very rapidly and sea level rises very rapidly. And it's not an accident that 11,600 years ago is exactly the period that Plato pointed to in the story of Atlantis, because he said that Atlantis was destroyed, submerged by a giant flood and earthquakes 9,000 years before the time of Solon. And 9,000 years, Solon is 600 BC, so that's 9,600 BC, that is 11,600 years ago.
Wow.
That is the end of the Younger Dryas. Now, how could Plato have made that up, you know? It connects perfectly.
To try to say that isn't a link is a conspiracy theory.
I believe it's a conspiracy theory. To dismiss that, as mainstream academics have done, they've tried every way to make Plato not say there was a cataclysm 11,600 years ago. They even say that he's talking about months instead of years. I mean, this was Plato. When he said years, he meant years.
Yeah.
Solon was his own ancestor. He received this story through Solon. He was reporting what for him was a very strong and definite fact, that there had been an event that had destroyed a great civilization 9,000 years before the time of Solon, and in our time frame, that is 11,600 years before our time. You know, it just all adds up. So I think it's going to become more and more difficult for mainstream archaeology to dismiss this as we start seeing new evidence emerging all over the world. First of all, we now have a smoking gun. We didn't have that before. Yes, we all understood that the end of the Ice Age was cataclysmic, but we didn't have an actual very specific smoking gun. See, when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, I focused very much on the window between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago. And the moment that the comet hits the Earth, which we now know, but I did not know when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, is 12,980 years ago. Okay, that is exactly in that window.
Right.
I wasn't able to give my readers a smoking gun when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, rather just to say
I didn't remember reading
yeah,
that. So
it isn't in there because the evidence on the comet had not been discovered in 1995. This has all come out since 2007, and it's been a debate in science, but the evidence keeps coming in, and really no serious geologist is now disputing that the Earth was hit by a comet 12,980 years ago, and then you have this 1,600-year deep freeze, and 11,600 years ago we come out of it. And the whole story of human civilization as we have it today all unfolds in that last 11,600 years. And what happens before that is a blank. And I would say the reason that it's a blank is because of this horrendous cataclysm that overtook the Earth. We know that many of the great megafauna, the mammoths, the rhinos, died out during the Younger Dryas, and we now know what caused the Younger Dryas. So we're getting much closer to understanding what happened and why we are a species with amnesia.
Well, let me put the tinfoil hat on real snug here for a moment. Is it possible, that's the Ancient Aliens signature line, right? Is it possible? Is it possible that someone disliked whoever was here on Earth? Maybe there was a war, maybe they had gotten themselves in a lot of trouble, and that somebody had the ability to take that comet and deliberately make sure that it was going to hit the ice cap?
Well, David, that's a very interesting speculation, I have to say. Because there are serious studies now being done unfortunately by the warmongers in our own civilization. One of the weapons they're looking at is how do we use an asteroid as a weapon?
Right.
How do we target an asteroid at our quote unquote enemies? What a shame, what a horror that human beings could even think that way, that our imagination could go in that direction, but maybe that's in our DNA in some way.
Right.
So it is not impossible. I can't sit here and say no, that's absolutely impossible. That somebody could have fired that comet at us or deflected it from its orbit to the point where it interacted with the Earth in cataclysmic ways. You
and I spoke in the car on the way here about the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch describes fallen angels, the Watchers, and that they interbred with humanity, that they created a race of giants, and that in the aftermath of that, Enoch was asked by the giants to talk to the Elohim, or God, and say, please don't wipe us out, because God, Elohim, said, you guys have become wicked and you need to be purged from the earth. And that apparently was the genesis of Noah's flood. Do you believe that we're talking about the biblical flood here?
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. I think the biblical flood needs not to be seen in isolation. We need to understand that that is part of a global tradition of a cataclysmic flood. Often, by the way, accompanied by a radical deep freeze. If you look at the cataclysmic myths in Iran, for example, they don't speak so much of a flood, they speak more of a terrible freeze, a dragon that caused the world to freeze. And the Iranian Noah figure, who's called Yima, actually doesn't create an ark, he creates an underground sanctuary into which human beings go, where the seeds of all life are preserved. The same story is told all around the world, and with interestingly different angles on it. In some cases it's a flood, in some cases, as in the case of the Iranian myths, it's a deep freeze. And what we now know is that both things happened, that there was flooding and there was a deep freeze, and the biblical story of the flood is part of that global tradition, and it's well understood. There's been very good scholarship on this, that the biblical flood is genetically related to the Gilgamesh epic from Sumer, and really we're looking at one story told in a number of different ways.
Well, I'm thinking of Rand and Rose Flemath and
Yes.
When the Sky Fell.
Yes, yeah, brilliant book.
Yeah.
They did really fantastic work, and they were the ones who raised working with the Earth crust displacement theory of Charles Hapgood. They were the ones who worked with and brought before the public the notion that Antarctica might have been the home of the lost civilization. And there's another author whose work is overlooked but deserves to be paid attention to, and that is Flavio Barbiero, who's an Italian author, a very scholarly man, who actually published a book called Civilization Under the Ice. I can't say it in Italian. It was published in the Italian language. Civilization Under the Ice, back in 1973 or 74, way before the Flemats or me or anybody was working on this, suggesting that Antarctica might have been the site of Atlantis. And what's interesting about Flavio Barbiero's work is that he connects this to a comet impact. Flavio Barbiero is looking at pole shift or Earth crust displacement, but he is considering the process that sets the Earth crust displacement in motion. And what he suggests is that the Earth is hit a glancing blow by a huge astronomical object, by a large comet, and that imparts the momentum that sets the crust in motion, or that creates the pole shift. So he was very, very far ahead of his time in that. There is a history to these ideas, and it's important to recognize Flavio's part in that.
Have you looked into how long most of the stuff that we have now would last if there was a pole shift? I mean, because metal rusts away, right? It doesn't.
Absolutely. I don't think that our civilization is very solidly founded. I think we could lose it all very rapidly. We are putting ourselves in danger in a number of ways, and one of those ways is the intense specialization of our civilization. That everybody is a specialist at something, but nobody knows how to do everything. You know, we're all very interdependent. We take so much for granted. There's food in the supermarkets, you know. Well, what does that all come down to? There's the concept called just in time with the delivery of food. We actually have about 3 days of food supplies in our cities. And if the supply line was cut, as it would be by a major cataclysm, you would have people starving in our cities within weeks, probably within days. It would be that bad. And you would then have riots, you would have massive civil disorder taking place. We've already seen it with what in these terms are very small scale events like Hurricane Katrina, the chaos that caused. Imagine that multiplied 1,000 times. Imagine a Katrina, but 1,000 times larger, affecting the advanced technological societies of our world. Imagine an event that raises sea level overnight 30 feet, flooding every coastal city in the world. Would our civilization survive that? I don't think so. I don't think we have the psychic resources to survive that. I think we're psychically very fragile. We're all very comfortable in our lives. We are all interdependent on others. Very few of us actually know how to survive. There are people who take survival seriously and who would know how to survive. But it's very interesting if you look at the NASA satellite photos of the areas of the Earth that are lit up by electricity today. It's very beautiful. They call it the black marble, I think. You can see these wonderful, brightly lit areas, the United States, Europe, you know, India, also increasingly brightly lit. And then you can see other areas that are dark, like the Amazon rainforest, or like Central Africa. Completely dark and almost no electricity showing at all. And these images are taken by us as a sign of the advancement and achievement of our technology, that we can light up the world. But what I would say is that it's the people who live in the dark areas, they're the ones who would survive a coming cataclysm, because they know how to live off the land. And we have forgotten that skill by and large. So we're fragile. And secondly, we're impermanent in the nature of the structures that we make. How many of our skyscrapers would still be there in 10,000 years' time? I don't think many of them would be. And if this was accompanied by gigantic earthquakes, as it easily could be, by large-scale flooding, we could be wiped from the face of the earth in a blink of an eye. and we would become the next lost civilization.
Yeah, in the blink of an eye, we could all be wiped from the face of the earth. That's not exactly the most comforting thought, but look, I don't think that's what's going to happen to us this time around, so please don't think that I'm trying to peddle fear porn here, but it did happen before. There is absolutely conclusive evidence, as you saw, with the nanodiamonds, with the platinum, with the iridium that's been found. We know that there was some sort of impact. It could have been a comet, could have been asteroids. John Anthony West, as we'll see later, says that it might have been some kind of coronal mass ejection from the sun. But the point is there was a great catastrophe, a series of two. And what this means is that there could have been a highly advanced civilization that got completely wiped clean. And that means that all bets are off as far as whether we would ever be able to find really tangible evidence of the type that archaeologists want to have. There's some intrinsic human blockage that we have around the idea of a mega catastrophe of this scope. We don't want to think about it. It's too horrifying. Coming up in the next episode, we're going to be talking to John Anthony West. And specifically, I wanted to engage him on something that people don't usually ask him about. Everybody knows John Anthony West as the guy who essentially backdated the Sphinx to make it much older, and we'll talk about how he did that. But I also wanted to talk to him about really the core of his work, The Serpent in the Sky, which is this notion of this French researcher named Schwaller de Lubis. I tried to get through his book, Temple of Man, and as I say in the interview, I enjoyed the pictures. That's about as much as I could do. So with West, we're going to hear some very interesting stuff about what did de Lubis contribute to the field of Egyptology in general, and specifically, how do we use the Sphinx and a new site in Turkey to help date ourselves much older than we ever thought we were before? That's coming up next time here on Disclosure, and I thank you for watching.